Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the Mimi Interim. So we're at the scheduled start time, but I think I'm going to allow just a couple more minutes to allow more participants to show up, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we can get going. So welcome everybody to the first of two scheduled Mimi interims in the near future. This one's going to be focused on the architecture and protocol drafts that were adopted back in Brisbane, or shortly after Brisbane, I should say. First off, can everybody hear me okay? I'm never sure on this particular machine.
Yep.
I hear you well.
Thank you. It looks like recent Meet Echo updates addressed some audio problems, which is nice. All right, so first off, I would like to remind everybody to become aware of the note well. If you were not aware, now you are. Please review, when you have a chance, the IETF's policies on intellectual property and code of conduct. Do we have anybody who would like to volunteer to be a note taker today? This is always the awkward part because we can't proceed without a note taker.
I can do it for the first hour, but I'll have to drop at the hour.
Are you sure about that? Because I mean, you're going to be leading the discussion, right?
I thought I was gonna do the first part. I thought we were gonna do some metadata stuff toward the end, right?
Yeah, in the back half. Well, I'll get to the agenda in a sec.
But in any case, I will have to drop at the hour. And looks like
Okay.
Brendan's volunteered.
Brendan, thanks very much. This is the second or third time in a row you've done this, so much appreciated. Okay, on to the agenda bash. So chair slides, which we're going to wrap up presently. Then, yeah, Richard is going to lead us through a bug scrub on the open issues on the Mimi Arch and Mimi Protocol repositories, which were just last week moved over into the Mimi Working Group GitHub organization. And then a little later on, yeah, we're going to talk about the Mimi metadata minimization proposal that was just recently circulated by Conrad and Raphael, which I would have preferred to do that first, but as it turns out, Conrad can't join us until a little later, so we have to wait a bit to get into that content. So essentially, we're gonna sandwich the bug scrub around the two. Rowan, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't need to talk about it today, but I did want to. I'm going to send a link in the chat to a work in progress of the content format that contains the TLS and CBOR encodings.
I think we can definitely find you some time to talk about this if you want. Like, well, I suspect Richard would agree we can carve some time for that out of the like 90 minutes ish reserved for going over GitHub issues.
I mean, I think I mostly wanted, people won't necessarily have time to look at it. So it's basically up to, up to the other participants who wants to, if they think it would be productive to have a glance at it and make some comments. Otherwise, I'll just send it in the chat.
Okay, anybody want to chime in on that? I suspect it would be, even if you just want to like introduce it. But if you think the main value of the discussion on it will be sort of critiques and comments that will principally come up like after anybody has had a chance to review it, then yeah, we can just circulate it on the list and come back to it.
I would say if we got time after the metadata thing, let's go ahead and queue it up, and then it can inform people's reading.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
All right, that sounds like a plan. In that case, sounds like the next thing up is to look at some GitHub issues. There we go. What button do I press here? Hang on. Let's see. Stop that.
Always a crapshoot.
Yeah, sorry. I get a slides control button, but that's not what we want here. That's not it. Sorry, folks, bear with me.
Passed slides control to me.
That's not it, right?
That's not it. Yeah, don't have slides.
Okay. Video, audio. This is annoying. I don't get a button. Okay, good. Sorry, I get a notification that you've asked to share screen, but I don't have anything to click to approve that, which is, oh, here we go. Aha.
Aha, that sounds good. Let's see if I can share a tab in Firefox from Firefox. Oh, that looks good. Is that visible?
Yep, looks good. Take it away,
All
Richard.
right, so I figure I'd start with Mimi Arch. There are currently no open issues or pull requests on this, so this may be a brief discussion. Anyone have issues in mind that we should have filed on this? I suppose we can, I filed a tracking issue on the protocol this morning about metadata, but we can do the same thing here. So we can have that as a tracking issue, but we can postpone any discussion on that till later. Any other thoughts on architecture? So otherwise, we'll bop over the protocol where we do have some stuff. Okay, let's go over to the protocol. So my usual order in which I do this is to start with pull requests because those are presumably more mature. Then we can dive over to issues if we get through all these. So all the PRs we have right now are basically things we didn't include in the draft we proposed for working group adoption because we were trying to keep that draft pretty minimal. So to help people help it be a consolidated target that people could understand. So a lot of these are things that are sort of next additions onto the base protocol document. Rowan, all of these are authored by you. Do you have a preference on which we start with? We have file download, looking up internal identifiers, abuse reporting, and consent.
I think consent It was the thing that I thought was most relevant.
Okay.
I mean, maybe I think these are more or less like in backwards order from, you know, like of importance.
Yep. All right, so I have the consent one up. Did you want to tee this up, Rowan?
So basically, the idea here is just that you have sort of four things that there are four messages that you could send. You could send a request for consent. So Alice could request consent. Let's say, yeah, Alice could request consent to add Bob to a group, with or without, you know, in general or to any group. Alice could cancel that request, could basically say, I no longer want to, I no longer care. Just it could result in less protocol overhead in a provider to client protocol, but it doesn't really have any, doesn't have sort of strong semantics in the provider to provider case. It's a sort of like a you know, a convenience. And then there is, and then from the perspective of Bob, in this case, Bob could grant consent with or without a particular room in mind. Bob could revoke consent, or you know, explicitly say, I'm not providing consent. And Bob could do this in any order with respect to Alice. So Bob doesn't need to wait for Alice to say, I don't ever want to provide consent to Alice. I want to say I never want to offer consent to Alice. Then it's just, you know, then there's just a mechanism that does those things. So those are the primitives. And there's some discussion in there about the privacy, that, you know, that in many cases the user would not want to leak, for example, that they said, no, I don't want to ever talk to Bob. That's common in instant messaging systems, that when you do that, Bob just doesn't find out. Does anybody have any comments about the sort of overall requirements for this kind of an explicit primitive?
One quick clarification, Ron. All of this is targeted at the connectivity establishment phase. So when Alice is initially asking to get in touch with Bob or to add Bob to a room.
I mean, I think that this is the place where it would most often be used, but you could use it in if you had an instant messaging system where you wanted to be able to only offer, you know, only allow consent on a per room basis, then you wouldn't necessarily do that, and you wouldn't necessarily need any kind of connection at all. It would just be, you know, Alice asked to invite you to, you know, to the following three groups. And, you know, there would be three separate requests saying, you know, do you want to join this acrobatics group? Do you want to join this, you know, this socialization group? And do you want to join this timeshare group? And you could, you know, Bob could say yes to the first two and no to the third one.
But what I meant is, like, if you imagine a scenario where Bob has in the past consented to being in 5 groups with Alice and is involved in those groups already, but then revokes consent to be connected with Alice. I don't think you're trying to address that case, right? Right. You're not saying
so
like, that revocation of consent would result in some change to those rooms.
it doesn't. It doesn't change the rooms. It just changes what happens if Alice tried to, re-init, for example, and then go and fetch a key package for Bob to add Bob to the replacement room. Then that permission would have been revoked, and that consent would have been revoked, and Alice would no longer be able to get packages for Bob for that room.
Other folks have thoughts on this? Conrad, Travis, I guess Conrad's not on yet, but Travis, I think you'd commented on this in the past.
Yeah, I took a look at it. I'm still contemplating some of the, I guess, like safety considerations around it of like personal user safety and all that. But I think vaguely the PR looks like a great direction forward.
Okay.
So maybe one thing to think about, although that's not directly related to the PR, but the question is regarding the metadata privacy on the server side. What does it mean if I block someone? That one I think is particularly tricky because that's one of the scenarios where you want to trust the server actually to enforce the block for you. But at the same time, that reveals that, at least in the past, you were connected to someone. So yeah, I don't have an answer or suggestion right now, but something to keep in mind.
I mean, I don't think it actually reveals anything, because when you, if Alice tries to fetch a key package, either she will be able to get a key package or not. If she's not able to get a key package, she'll get a message that says, you don't have consent, or you don't have consent in this room. And that message is under the control of the provider's policy, right? The provider can just
No,
say,
but that's not what I meant. What I meant was on Bob's provider, there will be a trace that Bob was connected to Alice once because Bob has not blocked Alice. So this is what we want to avoid, in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, this this consent is talking about getting key packages, and I think key packages, in general, I anticipate this will be a main topic of discussion during the latter half of this call. But that, the existence of a directory, a provider directory of key packages, makes all sorts of metadata privacy possible, and it's not strictly required for Alice to talk to Bob if you're willing to accept a little bit more, a little bit less convenience. So, I think that we absolutely want to have key packages and consent mechanism. And if you're really concerned about metadata privacy, then your provider, maybe in a mode, don't need to take advantage of those facilities at all.
I mean, if it's purely for the key packages, then we actually already have a solution.
So just to digress a little bit, I'm showing on the screen here the tracking issue I filed this morning about metadata. It seems like we have kind of inherent trade-off between servers providing policy enforcement functions and exposing metadata to those services to support the policy enforcement. So I think there's a general discussion to be had here about what policy function servers are providing, and what metadata they get exposed to. So I think it's a good thing to keep in mind. We got the tracking issue. Yeah. Back to this one. Sorry, other thoughts on this? Otherwise, I would propose we merge this as kind of a starting point, and we can always iterate on the details later. Concerns about that approach?
Seems to me, if you have no objections and sufficient consensus amongst the document editors, then why not?
All right. Looks like we have conflicts, so I'm just going to add a note here.
Yeah, I will go and resolve any conflicts. Some of these things have been, they were copied over
Yep.
from the previous repo, so who knows what's the.
Yep. No, that's fine. So there's a note on the PR now that you can feel free to merge once you resolve those conflicts. All right. Next. Back here. Abuse reporting. Rowan, this is also yours. You want to tee this up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I modeled this very much as the ability for someone to say there has been abuse and to provide the specific messages that were considered abusive, like a specific number of messages that were considered abusive, and the nonce and decryption key that is only relevant for that message in MLS. So this is very, it's very MLS specific. But this, I think, in terms of being able to demonstrate that there was a way to do this, this was very important. That we received feedback from 2 large operators that this was that they needed to understand how they could go and do something like this without necessarily drilling down on the details of the mechanism. They needed to see an existence proof. So that's what this was for. There hasn't been a lot of review on what the requirements are, but I think it's pretty straightforward for what for what it does right now.
All right. So I'm wondering, sorry, I'm seeing in the abusive message structure that it contains like inline the encrypted application message, which I suppose the complainant in this scenario is claiming like constitutes the abuse. So is there any way though to prove that the message, say, actually occurred in the group? Like, can the complainant forge abusive content, right, that they then send to the service provider and claim that some other user sent to them?
Yeah, I think so. But
that makes sense to me, because like, I feel like otherwise the provider would have to like store every encrypted message so that then they could check that like the abusive message corresponds to some encrypted message that was previously transmitted to the group or something, which sounds like probably a difficult requirement for providers. But I guess the other thing I don't know is like, what's the state of the art in IAM services for abuse reports? Like, do the ones that exist and are already deployed allow complainants to sort of lie about or fabricate abusive content?
Yeah, I think I'll let Raphael comment about the ability to come up with such a message, but there's no way for the server to really know because of the nature of MLS what they don't have access to any of the key material for the group. Therefore, there's not a lot they can do there, but there is the signature of the message and there's the credentials and all that. So yeah, let's see what Travis has to say.
Yeah, I guess to briefly answer that sort of question, the provider mostly just kind of needs beyond a reasonable doubt sort of idea that the message is authentic in some way. That can be proven as like, hey, here's a ciphertext and here's a decryption key, and it decrypts just fine. So it's really hard to fabricate it in that sense. My question was going to be more around the continuation of the thread we have kind of going on the PR there, around I'm not sure it makes sense for reports to be sent to the hub. They should be sent directly to the provider, noting that we should never be in a situation where reports are automatically forwarded to the provider where the report needs to be received. There obviously should be conditions on whether or not a report is sent over this protocol, but those conditions are outside the scope of the protocol, in my opinion.
Hey, so I
Yeah.
wanted to say that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Brendan.
I wanted to say that there's not really a forgery risk in the sense that I can totally invent something new that looks like it was sent to the group, because messages are signed and we sign the group ID and we sign the epoch. So it does require users to send a message to the group. The forgery risk that actually exists is the fact that you don't have any way to prove that the key and the nonce were derived correctly. So I can like have an encrypted MLS message that I send to the group. I maybe actually am in the group. I did actually mean to send that group, but it's, I believe, actually fairly easy to reverse engineer a key and a nonce that makes that encrypt to potentially something else, and then that will still verify and everything. So the forgery risk is realistic, and you'd have to add some kind of franking to fix that.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. So I think because we don't have key commitment for AED, you can forge ciphertext, actually. The signature does say that, but the problem is whether in practical terms, the provider can actually verify that signature at the point when it receives a message, because it means it needs to have access to the AD, etc. So it's like on paper, it sounds trivial. You have a signature, therefore it's authenticated. In practice, you really need to be sure. You can always verify that. I think what's still the state of the art is what Facebook does with message franking, like Brendan said. And so, contrary to what you said earlier, Tim, you don't need to store every ciphertext on the provider. You can just, MAC it, something you can then later recognize. And in the sense, but of course, in a federated setting, this might actually be harder. So that means that the hub would do the franking, and therefore only the hub can actually also verify the franking if it's a symmetric signature, because regular signatures would actually be quite expensive, I suppose. So long story short, franking might be the solution here. The proposed approach of just sending the key to the ciphertext is definitely not good enough.
Yeah, I think this is, so first to Tim's high level point, like I think that forgery by the reporter of messages is something we need to address. I think we might need a little bit more analysis on this because, like Brendan said, the signature does put us in a different posture. I'm showing here the signed data structure, or at least part of the signed data structure in MLS. And so the signature is bound to a specific group ID and epoch, all that stuff that's in the header of the MLS message. So we're in just by virtue of the MLS signature structure, we're in a much stronger position than the usual franking scenario where you just have an AEAD. Here you have that asymmetric operation that binds to a bunch of stuff. So we're basically, on the one hand, the MLS is not deniable, and a bunch of people have done hand wringing about that. But here we actually benefit from that non-repudiation. It's plausible to me. There's still, there's still a few copy pasting risks that that franking could help address. But yeah, I think we need a little bit more analysis to see exactly how much the signature here gets us, and whether we need the extra franking mechanism. Raphael, do you have further thoughts? Raphael, you are next in the queue. Did you mean to be in queue?
Sorry, I was on mute. Apologies for that. So the interface is tricky. So yeah, in the pseudonymous approach we're going to talk about in a minute, you also use signature keys, but they're not directly linked to your identity because they're pseudonymous. So this would make it, way trickier for a hub actually to verify them. And if it succeeds, then it means that somebody has been de-anonymized, which is not great. So yeah, I'm quite cautious about using the MLS signatures as a franking mechanism.
Wait, Raphael, could
Okay.
you say that last bit again? I was with you. It sounded to me like the signature could help even in the metadata limited case, but then you came to a conclusion I wasn't expecting.
Well, I mean, it's still the same signature mechanism, but first of all, the hub is missing the link between the pseudonymous identity and the real identity.
I see.
So that's a practical problem. If we want to resolve that link, we have de-anonymized someone, which we maybe don't want to do. So we're between a rock and a hard place, essentially.
Arguably, the one time that you do want to de-anonymize a pseudonymous user is if you verified that they are an abuser, but it requires the cooperation of the clients. Like the hub can't do it by itself, the providers can't do it by themselves. So I think that there's a requirements discussion. I think we have done pretty well so far, and Mimi, with coming up with a small set of guiding principles that are requirements related, but we don't have a requirements document. We don't have, I don't think that we have consensus on requirements in detail at the moment. And I think that's where I think that's where we're going to have, a lot of our discussions are going to come down to what are the real requirements. And I think it's, I'm not saying that we are doing things out of order here. I mean, I think that you can kind of proceed, kind of go back and forth between protocol design to a certain point, and then, revise your requirements and go back and forth in that way. But I think that's particularly when we have this metadata privacy discussion, it's going to be a question of metadata privacy with respect to which parties and how much, and what other properties do we give up when that mode is enabled or whatever. Just a meta comment there.
So I would like to go back to a point that Travis raised. This question of where abuse reports should go. It seems like there's at least a few scenarios. It seems like the reporters provider would like to know. It seems like the hub might also like to know, so that it can, adjust its reputation for the abusive party. Then there's the abusive user's provider. Again, moving the reports closer to the abuser's provider could help quench it, but also could reveal information. And I suppose there could be some interest by the other providers involved in a room. So we have at least kind of 4 cases that we might want to address here. I think this is only covering the reporting to the provider. I think reporting to the reporter's provider doesn't actually need a Mimi action. Because it's just between the reporting client and the provider. So, but the other 3 cases remain. So, thoughts on that, Ron?
Yeah. Okay. So Harold said you shouldn't send reports to the abusers, to the alleged abuser's provider. And I think the reasons for that are the reasons why you may not want to do that are very clear. But I guess the question is, does anyone think that there are situations when we need to be able to do that, as opposed to there being some out of band disclosure mechanism, that doesn't even necessarily need to be a protocol over IP between the hub and the abuser's provider. Does anybody think we need that? Because then the only question is, do we send it to the hub? And we can't control whether it's sent to the local provider because it is always sent to the local provider.
Okay, Travis, do you have thoughts?
I guess to take the question a step further back, what are we trying to solve as part of the abuse reporting mechanism? Because it kind of feels like we may be almost cross purposes in a sense, where there's the case of trying to inform another provider, whoever that may be, that some form of undesirable content has occurred, versus almost what would be considered, I guess, like a takedown notice of like, hey, I strongly believe that this should not exist. Please remove it. And the responsibility of those two things falls to different people. Because if we're or if we're just trying to indicate that something is undesirable, that doesn't need a who is reporting this field. That just needs a flag to say, like, this content is undesirable. It gets distributed amongst providers in some way, and decisions can be either made or not made based off of that information. Whereas this PR kind of feels like it's more almost like a client server endpoint that has bled into the protocol document almost, trying to figure out how to, from a user perspective, indicate to somebody that, hey, please deal with my report, which again is a very different operating environment.
Yeah. So I haven't heard anybody screaming that we need to be able to notify the alleged abuser's provider using the MIMI protocol. The reporter's provider presumably is going to get this through their client to provider protocol. So the question is, why might we need to send this information to the hub? And I think this comes down to what's the room policy. So if the hub provider is ultimately responsible for enforcing its policies, that the hub could have a policy that says, well, I'm going to enforce the following rules for my providers, but everybody here has signed an agreement, and feel free to write our lawyers if there was a problem. Here's how you can contact the other providers. However, if you want to be able to capture this in an automated way, particularly where we've got key schedules where you're automatically deleting decryption keys and so on, then it seems like even if not every provider takes advantage of the mechanism as a hub and like uses it, that there are many hubs where they would want to know. So if there's a WhatsApp group and WhatsApp says you're not allowed to have, here's our acceptable use policy, you're not allowed to discuss hate speech, terrorism, child pornography, whatever, and somebody wants to send a report, that they want to be able to see that in order to be able to make their own decision about that. And I think that is I think that that's a reasonable request on behalf of a provider, considering that they are on the hook in terms of legal liability. And I don't think it needs to be mandatory that everybody has to use it.
I guess as a point of clarification, the hub is enforcing the room's policies, not its policies. The hub can't invent policies. And so like that kind of opens up the question of, I guess, like what kind of abuse reports are we trying to prioritize here? Because there's, again, multiple different kinds. Like the space, I think, is larger than we anticipate, where CSAM should be reported to the hub because the hub has that legal liability concern. But reports of, I just don't like this user, or what they said, that can probably just not go to the hub and go to the individual reporter instead, or to the abusive provider instead. So it almost feels like the mechanism here should be just a generic send report to provider, potentially anonymously, given the sensitivity of some concerns. And then, yeah, it's an implementation or specific provider level responsibility to decide when and how to use those different endpoints, particularly under their legal requirements. Whether that's send everything to the hub or send everything to the abusive provider, or some combination therein, potentially broadcasting it to every provider if desirable.
I actually am queued to ask a question of the chairs. If they could maybe remind us if we have any guidance from the charter on what we should be working on with regard to abuse.
Thanks for that exciting opportunity, Richard. Yeah, so with the text that's in the charter, actually, as far as abuse goes, only discusses two things that are explicitly out of scope. The first being metadata processing to manage spam and abuse. The second being development of anti-spam or anti-abuse algorithms. So I don't know, in my personal opinion, what we're discussing here, what we're discussing here does not apply to the second point. And I don't think that we're discussing like algorithms for detecting a spam or abuse, or managing it, or like assigning risk or reputation scores to users. So I don't think we've run afoul of that. But metadata processing to manage spam and abuse is perhaps a bit more ambiguous, in that, does an abuse report constitute metadata?
I might emphasize processing in that, and we're just defining what the metadata is that you might exchange.
Yeah, as opposed to, say, reporting it to a provider so that that provider can then do something with it. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yes.
I also
go ahead. Go ahead.
Personally, my intuition here is that the implicit requirement is to do at least as well as existing messaging services do. Because anybody who's going to want to participate in Mimi, I think as several people have argued already, are under existing regulatory requirements to do some sort of abuse mitigation, right, and management. So if Mimi makes that impossible, then presumably that's going to be a non-starter for adoption, or a deal breaker rather for adoption of Mimi by these messaging vendors. I thought I had another point on this. I think it does come down to the essential question. I think it was Travis raising it, of whether this is really a Mimi protocol interaction. Like, is this just between a client and its home provider, or is this something that Mimi needs to spell out messages for, because there's an interaction here either with the hub necessarily or between providers, so that one of them could tell the other, like, hey, my user is complaining, but one of your users is abusive. I'm also concerned. I feel like if Daniel Kahn-Gilmore were here, they might argue that we have to be cautious about punting too much of this to just say, like, well, all we have to do is provide a mechanism by which somebody could indicate to a provider that, like, something bad may have happened, and then the providers will figure it out amongst themselves, because that might create an implicit requirement that in order to do Mimi, you must be this tall to ride the ride. Like, you must have this big of a legal team to participate here and to be able to like sign the necessary contracts with the big players. And that worries me a bit. Okay, people are jumping in the queue, so I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think we will see how things shape out, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was must be this tall to ride at this in terms of this stuff anyway. On the question of whether this is a Mimi thing, I think even if this is largely a local interaction, I think there's some benefits of documenting how to address the reporter forgery problem. And that's a thing where there's a bunch of academic work out there. There's some deployed art, but not a clear interoperable specification. So I think a specification of how you can address that reporter forgery problem in the MLS context would be handy, kind of irrespective of anything else, as long as we think that there's going to be some reporting mechanism. Alyssa?
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Or no? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm in kind of a loud place. I also just wanted to raise the question of the need for, like, what is the actual need for standardization of this communication between the providers? Because you can potentially imagine that different pairs of providers make different arrangements about what data they want to exchange for abuse reporting. Like, if two of them already have very similar formats and categories of data that they use for abuse reporting in their existing systems, then maybe they want to just use that. But if there's a third one, like, maybe they want to do it a different way. So I don't know. I'm not totally, I can definitely see how having like some mechanism by which providers can trust each other to exchange like generic information is useful, and maybe that it ties into like a specific message ID or something. But otherwise, I am just curious, like, what the need for standardization is.
I guess to try and answer both questions relatively succinctly, I do think that there is a need to have an endpoint between providers in particular where this abuse reporting can happen. I don't think it's necessarily the responsibility of Mimi to define what the individual regulatory or compliance requirements are on a provider. There may be some advice given around the specification, but not necessarily within the specification. And that's largely just because the regulatory environment is different for every provider. If you're in Europe, it has been largely decided for you what those requirements are. And then if you're in the US, it's a different thing that may or may not be changing depending on the state of those sorts of proposals. The need for standardization is largely, regardless of the environment, all of the environments need some way to report to another provider that something has happened. The requirements of whether or not you handle that either immediately or like the sort of operating procedure of receiving that report, that is defined by the regulatory environment, not by Mimi necessarily.
Ori?
Hi. So I heard the word charter, so I've appeared. Channeling Roman. I'm new to the work, so I just want to understand: is this consideration here that there seems value in standardizing an endpoint and some aspects of a data model regarding abuse, but as Alyssa pointed out, as the chairs have already said, metadata processing to manage spam and abuse is out of scope, and the development of anti-spam or anti-abuse algorithms is out of scope. So defining this endpoint and possibly some of the data model issues, I just want to understand what the value of standardization would be given those scoping considerations. So, and I'm sorry, I was sort of zoned out before I heard the word charter. So if you could just recap briefly the sort of what's happening, what's being proposed here, and how is it impacting these particular scope items in the charter? Thanks.
Yeah, so
I could,
just to remind you, yeah, go ahead, Ron.
Okay, so I was going to say, to give two concrete examples. So the users, the sender, the reporter's provider and the alleged abuser's provider, let's say that they both are in North America and there is a hub that is located in France, and there's a policy on the room that says that, per French law, you're not allowed to discuss, Holocaust denying or sale of Nazi memorabilia. So providing a mechanism where someone can say, I think this is in violation of the policy of the room, and provide a way to decrypt just specific messages that appeared that were sent to in the context of the room. That provides a primitive that can then be used using whatever policy is defined elsewhere, and is out of scope. Likewise, another example would be, you could have a group that has all sorts of discussions and images that are explicit, but it's hosted in Japan, and the room policy says there may not be any display of pubic hair. So those are both, pretty straightforward legal requirements in those countries.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say something a little different, which is my read here is that basically what we're talking about with this mechanism is an input to those things that are out of scope. So the providers that are involved in a MIMI interaction are going to do some computations to decide what's actually abusive and what actions to take. But they need to share some information as inputs to those algorithms, and that's what we're talking about here.
And that process may be it may be human or may be automated, right? It's not necessarily the input goes into an algorithm. The input could into a computer algorithm. It could be into a human algorithm.
So, sorry, to tack on an opinion. Sorry, it feels weird to speak. It feels weird to speak as the chair, but we were talking about reporter forgery. Mechanisms to address reporter forgery. And the ones that we started sketching out here, depend strongly upon the detail of MLS. That being the case, MIMI seems like a great place to then define those mechanisms for authenticity of abuse reports, especially since I think by definition this is a problem where you want it to be generated on one client and be verifiable by an arbitrary provider. So that does seem like valuable work for this working group.
Yeah, so as you can see on the screen, I've been trying to sketch some conclusions here as we're kind of running up on time. It seems like folks agree that if we do have a reporting mechanism here, we need to address this reporter forgery problem, and we'll figure out what the right set of cryptographic mechanisms are. The other point I was going to capture here is that it does seem worth having an endpoint here for sharing anti-abuse information. Whether that's an endpoint specifically on the hub for a room or more generically inter-provider, as Travis suggested. Seems like we're not clear on exactly where the endpoint is, but having an endpoint definition seems useful. Does anyone have strong disagreements or reservations about those conclusions?
I guess just as a future concern on the reporter forgery side of things, it is important to at least me that we protect the identity, human or otherwise, of the reporter itself, primarily to prevent future abuse reports from being filed effectively.
Yeah, from what I know of these mechanisms, that should be a feasible requirement to meet. All right, what do we think next steps are here? Rowan, I think you are the author of this PR. Do you feel like you have enough information to revise this? It's currently draft, so I guess revise it into a potentially mergeable state.
Yeah, I will need some, I think I'll need some help from somebody on, forgeability, franking, text, and possibly mechanism. But if I've got some plausible mechanism there, then I can come back with something that we can discuss briefly on the list, or can check in if there seems to be a quorum.
All right, I think that brings us to
conclusion. Yeah, I mean, we've got 4 minutes left for the first half. Do we want to just skip the other two PRs here?
So we don't have to skip them per se. I think what we should do next is cut over to the conversation about metadata minimization. And should we wrap that up before the end of the overall 2-hour session, we can cut back to going through PRs and issues on the protocol document.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. In that case, thanks, Richard. You're off the hook for now. There we go. Okay. So, Conrad, Raphael, are you ready to talk about metadata? I assume you don't have slides. You're welcome. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to throw up on screen. I'd be happy to share the draft you submitted.
Yeah. So sorry. Hi, everyone. We do have slides. I cobbled together a few slides. I can send you the Google Slides link. It should work. Whoops. 1 second. Just copy it into the chat here. Where is it? Where is it now? Interfaces. Yep. Okay, and I can try sharing. In the past, that's worked with. Oh. Okay.
I granted you screen share. Now I guess you just got to fight with your browser to find the right tab.
Yeah. 1 second.
Let me know if it doesn't work. I can share it from here and drive the slides.
All right.
Oh, there we go.
Should work.
Awesome. In that case, take it away.
Okay. So metadata minimization. First, maybe let's talk about what we want to do and what we don't necessarily want to do. So the goals here are that a remote service provider, from the point of view of a user, can track that user's activity across groups. And we differentiate here a bit between the user's local service provider versus the remote one, because at the user's local service provider, it really depends a lot on what the user's interaction with the local service provider looks like, and that could preserve those guarantees and help maintain them or even give better guarantees. But here we're focusing on the scenario where a user is interacting with a hub that's not his own service provider. But of course, we can discuss at some later date maybe what it could look like on the user's local service provider. So non-goals, although would be nice to do, but at least we don't want to do it with this proposal, is provide complete anonymity. And we don't obfuscate any network traffic patterns. We would consider that orthogonal, so you could use Tor or something, or a mixnet if you wanted to do that. And we also don't hide any in-group activity. As you will see, it's pseudonym based, so each user has a pseudonym in a group, and with that pseudonym, the server can see like the actions of each pseudonymous user. So what do? We do, as I said, we want to use pseudonyms, and kind of our main tool here
Sorry,
is,
Conrad.
yeah.
Brendan's in the queue. Do you want to
Oh,
take
sorry,
questions
sorry,
now,
yeah.
or?
Yeah, please go ahead, Brendan. Sorry, I didn't see the...
Hey, I just wanted to ask if you could expand more on what you mean when you say you don't want to provide anonymity. Like, do you mean you don't want to provide anonymity between the user and its local service provider, or?
We provide pseudonymity within a group. I just wanted to like we're somewhere, like it's not, users are not completely anonymous when they interact with the remote service provider, is what I was trying to say. So it's not to the level of where I'm not even sure you'd be anonymous, completely anonymous there, but if you encrypt handshake messages, for example, as you proposed, you'd have a much stronger guarantee. I was just trying to kind of manage expectations a bit in terms of what we can achieve with this pseudonymous approach. Although, and I didn't list the benefits that we get with a pseudonymous approach as opposed to a kind of completely encrypted approach, is that we're still using non-encrypted handshake messages, and the server can still keep track of the registry in MLS terms and the group state, and thus can help new members join a group by providing that for download. And you don't need to upload everything with every commit because the server doesn't know what the group state looks like. Okay, so we want to use...
Maybe I can quickly interject here. So I think it depends from which perspective you look at that. So from the perspective of the server, it is, of course, anonymous. So I think there's even a legal definition of what anonymous and pseudonymous means in the context of data protection. So pseudonymous means it's merely an alias to something, to real identity. And that is true for all the users in a group. But from the server's perspective, it is truly anonymous in the sense that the server does not have any information to correlate pseudonyms with real-life identities.
Right, okay, so it depends a bit on how you define anonymous, maybe. My understanding was that it's not really anonymous if you can provide like an easy link for someone to connect the real identity with the anonymous one, and then it would just be a pseudonym. But okay, let's just talk about how it works, and then people can see what we're trying to do here. Or do you want to go deeper into this discussion? Okay. I can actually move the window here. You can see the slides. Okay. So we're mainly going to use these credentials and call them pseudonymous credentials. And the pseudonymous credentials are kind of analogous to the real credentials, or it's not clear what they look like yet because we don't have an authentication service for MIME yet, but you'd expect them to include a user identifier and a client identifier. And the pseudonymous credentials contain a user pseudonym, a client pseudonym, and the per group signature public key. This is the signature public key that you also use to sign your MLS messages in the group. And the pseudonymous credential also contains this kind of real credential, whatever that's going to look like, but in encrypted form. And then what we need to talk about is what are the challenges that arise from using these credentials while still allowing people to fully authenticate each of the group members and manage these credentials and distribute them and that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's, now I've hidden the window here somewhere, my bad. There we go. Okay, so what are the limitations with the approach? Just to put it up front. So this requires the notion of connection between users. So this, and I'm not sure we we've settled on whether we want this for Mimi or what exactly it looks like, but it's a notion where you have, and you find this in many messengers, of course, you have people on your contact list, or those are the people that can, essentially for the purposes of this approach, those are the people that can add you into groups. And those are the people that have the power to reveal your identity, like connect the pseudonymous credential with the real credential, and do that kind of partially in the context of a group. Rohan, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was imagining you could do this in a different way, which would be if you don't have connections and the policy of the room that you're in allows pseudonymous messages, the user could reveal to everyone in the group their real identity by saying, this pseudonym is, by providing a binding. You don't necessarily need a connection in order to do that, and you could have been invited by, your friend or a third party who's also in the group, sending you like a joining code, or sending you a group info that you use to join, and then you say, you could be rendered differently with your pseudonym until you, or even maybe not allowed. Maybe your any messages you send are hidden, or you're not allowed to you're not allowed to do certain things. But then as soon as you start, as soon as you reveal yourself to the group, then you get more privileges.
Yeah, that's a possibility. So we try to go for the completely asynchronous approach and try to get try to figure out what's needed for immediate kind of authentication upon joining. But of course, you can delay that until someone comes online and then later reveal who they are. And for that, you don't need a connected user.
Right. Yeah. And I didn't mean to say that you shouldn't go and do this connection model. I just wanted to make sure that, that we might have, we might have 2 or 3 approaches, and we can kind of, pick off the Chinese menu, as it were.
That's fair. And just to note that in this other mode where you have this later reveal, so if you don't have a connection, you need this later reveal. You cannot immediately have a revelation if someone just adds you to a group out of nowhere. But that's fair, I guess. So that also means, and I guess that's essentially what Rohan just said, or kind of as a corollary, external joins become more difficult because you can join externally. That's fine, but then you can't. That's kind of as the flip side. If you join a group without having someone invite you, then you don't know who anyone is. Everyone is going to look pseudonymous until someone comes online and gives you the key material required to authenticate everyone. So there too is this kind of delay. Raphael here.
Yeah, I just want to get back to one point that Richard raised a while back. So the whole effort here is not so much how to actually obfuscate the data or to make it disappear. That's relatively easy. The whole point here is that we can still defend ourselves against DOS attacks, malicious insider attacks, etc., especially in a federated environment, and have the hub or other providers retain some power to actually evict users, etc., in case of malicious behavior. So the real difficulty lies in having these mechanisms in place and not making the information disappear, just for context.
Right. Okay. Maybe let's jump into a few details on what this entails then in terms of mechanism. So the Mimimi approach, couldn't resist the name, sorry. So this is just a sketch of how we could do this connection establishment in a privacy-preserving manner, similar to this sealed senders approach. Again, this is just a sketch, kind of showcasing the principle. We can, of course, tweak it. So here, the clients or users would publish a connection initiation key, which is a public HPKE key, and they would publish that to their service provider when they create the user. And the service provider would then make that available to other users. So the initiator who wanted to initiate a connection with the responder could fetch that connection initiation key. Then they would create a group, and then they would encrypt the group ID and their own connection key. And the connection key is the key that's required to link this real identity with the pseudonymous identity. So they could send that to the responder. The responder would then do an external join into the group that the initiator created based on the group ID. And maybe we'd have to add some more, like an authentication token that would allow them to join this group. And sorry, I'm talking about groups here because our kind of primary goal was to make this work on a kind of cryptographic function level within MLS rather than the room level, which is the level to which we yet have to lift it. But we wanted to talk about this whole thing conceptually at first, and then we can figure out how to lift it into the world of rooms. Brendan.
Hey, so I believe in this group, all that you're doing is exchanging the connection key, right?
In the what? Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
So when you have the responder externally joining this group from the initiator, the purpose of doing that is that they have an encrypted channel to exchange each other's connection keys. Yes.
Yes.
So is there a purpose for having that group? Is there a purpose to actually make that an MLS group and have it be long-lived? Or is this just like a one-time exchange of connection keys?
Yeah, for the purpose of this mechanism, it's really just about exchanging connection keys. Yeah, good point. We could simplify that down. I mean, having a group between connected users is probably useful for other things. Like if you wanted to rotate these connection keys later on, you already have a channel. But yeah, you're right. We could totally make that more lightweight.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, good point. Whoops, sorry. And then finally, the responder also, of course, has to provide the connection key to the initiator. Okay, so this brings us to a question. So if I have user level pseudonyms and we want to disconnect the pseudonyms, we want different pseudonyms across groups, but we want to upload key packages, and when we upload them, we don't yet know which groups they're being used in. So imagine you have multiple clients as a user, and someone comes and wants to add you to a group. They're going to fetch multiple key packages to put you in a group. And then for those key packages that the user uses, all the user level pseudonyms have to line up so that actually you have the same user level pseudonym in that group. And to do that, we have to do kind of a bit more juggling with key packages to where whenever a client wants to upload key packages, it first has to check, what key packages have other clients uploaded and what are the user pseudonyms that they're using in those key packages. And then they upload matching key packages to the point where you have these key package sets, where for each key package set, you have one key package per client. They all have the same user level pseudonym and then different client level pseudonyms. And this is all to ensure that you have the same consistent user pseudonym within each individual group. Yeah, so that's just small limitations in terms of key package uploads. It makes it a bit more complicated, but we think that's okay. And then, right. And then one more note on key packages, and that's last resort key packages. Of course, if you're running out of key packages and people start reusing one key package in multiple groups, that of course makes it visible to the hub that it's the same entity every time. They still cannot link the pseudonym to the real identity, but they know that it's the same identity across multiple groups. What you could do for that one, you could have more than one last resort key package and then have the provider who provides these key packages to people who request key packages is kind of cycle these key packages to where you have, say, 10 last resort key packages, and then it's going to give out first the first one, second one, and once it's reached the last one, it gives out the first one again, so that you have this, you still have some some disconnect between the individual groups that you join over time. Again, like a small quirk in terms of key packages that can be mitigated, but yeah, just as a note. Rohan, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say if I were implementing something where I wanted to have this level of metadata privacy, I would just forego using key packages altogether and only use methods of joining that didn't require. I would forego using the target user's provider directory of key packages. I would only use, I would include key packages in messages that were sent out of band or directly, in another group, or were introduced by a third party only. So I think that, while I don't think it's a bad idea to go and pursue these, this idea of using last resort key packages. If someone is, someone says, well, I don't like this because this could potentially leak this information in these cases, then there is a remedy, which is just don't use a directory of key packages for this purpose. You can do it in, here are a list of known ways that are more safe.
Yeah, and we've experimented. So thanks. That's a very good point. We wanted to imitate kind of the non-metadata private flows and make all of these flows possible. So that's what we did. We also experimented with something that you essentially alluded to just now, where you have these connection groups, and then users provide specific key packages to each of their connected users, and then they don't have to go and download, which is also nice because it leaks less metadata in terms of fetching the key packages and stuff. So that's another way you could go about it. But of course, you do need key packages somehow if you want to have this asynchronous joining, this asynchronous adding mechanism. And then by the nature of these key packages, you might run out. And then in those cases, you will run into last resort issues eventually. So yeah, but yeah, there are different options for sure. And we've picked out this one because it kind of mimics the flow that we're already using in the non-metadata private version. Okay, so maybe the most interesting or the most complex part of this whole thing is how do we have these credentials, pseudonymous credentials, and within these pseudonymous credentials, we have these ciphertexts that contain the real credentials. So how do we manage the keys for these ciphertexts? And the idea is to have a connection key, and that connection key, each user has a connection key and shares that connection key with each connected user, as the name kind of applies. And then from this connection key, we derive individual credential keys for each individual key package that is generated and uploaded to the key package server, or indeed distributed maybe in some other way. And because we derive these individual keys, they're all unique to the key package, and they can thus be shared within individual groups without, by way of sharing one key for one key package, not all other key packages are also de-pseudonymizable by whoever holds those keys. And then, so now we're in a situation where, okay, Alice has added Bob to a group, and Alice is able to share the credential key for the key packages that Alice used to add Bob to the group. But now we have a requirement that whoever joins the group also needs all these keys. And that's a bit annoying because it ends up creating quite a bit of friction. You have to upload a lot of stuff so you can encrypt that key and send it to the server to get some server assist. But then you encrypt it, you upload it to the server. So what happens if someone gets removed and then someone gets added again? So should the person who gets added have access to the key material of previously removed members, or to the key material to decrypt the credential keys of previously added members? So in a nutshell, we want forward secrecy and we want post-compromise security for all these encrypted credential keys that we add to the server to make services possible. And we do that by using a new, in air quotes, protocol, because we haven't looked at the literature enough, and probably someone in the 90s way smarter than us has already come up with such a mechanism, but we haven't found it yet. So that's, it's might not be new. But for now, we call it tree wrap, and it's essentially kind of a tree wrapping mechanism that looks like a tree, of course. And you have a root key that wraps the children, and then you that wraps the children of the root, and then those wrap the keys that are in their children, etc., and all the way up until you have the number of leaves that match the number of leaves in the MLS ratchet tree. And those leaves are the keys that then wrap the credential encryption keys. And then using similar tree mechanics as an MLS, we can remove, if someone leaves the group, we can essentially blank the path to that decryption key for their credentials. Someone gets added to the group, we can create a new path, we can extend the tree, and all these things. And as a result, we can do add, remove, and update operations on that tree in log n, roughly in log n. And then if someone joins the group, they will have to download the whole tree once, unfortunately, but that's they're going to have to download the group state anyway, which is quite a bit more. So this just adds 2n times 32 bytes roughly to the download. And then we can have this nice very fine-grained forward secret and very fine-grained post-compromise secret construction that protects the credential encryption keys of everyone in a group. So yeah, to jump through a few hoops there, but we think it's possible. And this is something we're currently still working on, figuring out the kinks and figuring out if something like this maybe exists already, and maybe someone's already done some work on this that makes it even better or something. Yeah. Okay, so that brings us to open problems, and there are probably a few more than the ones that I have here. Rohan, yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, the problem that you're describing on the previous slide, that looks pretty cool. If you're doing individual user disclosure of their mapping of their pseudonym, if that's sent as a private message inside the group, then you get the property that it's only seen by people in that epoch. People could still remember that later, but is that, I'd be interested, not necessarily here, but sort of, in the draft, like a discussion of like, this is not as good as this because XYZ, right?
Yeah, again, this is all relatively fresh. It's probably something that can be generalized to something else. Like there's a thing called updatable encryption. It might be something like that. It might be useful for other things than these credential encryptions. But yeah, it's roughly how you say it would work. So if I add someone to a group, I would then create the commit, and then I will have to send the encryption key to the added person's credential. I will have to include that in the commit somehow, maybe via a custom proposal. And this would be work that we do in the MLS working group, of course. But I would have to include that. But the rest of the tree updates can probably be derived from an exporter of the new epoch in the MLS group. And so we can sync these tree wrap epochs very closely with the MLS group epochs and get some nice FS and PCS guarantees, but also we have to send around very little payload except for situations where the adder has to download a little bit, and the person who's added also, of course, has to download the tree to actually get all of these credential encryption keys. Raphael.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that and explain what FS and PCS mean. So what that means is that when a user is added, they should not be able to discover past participants in that conversation. They should only be able to discover the people that are currently in that conversation. So that's the one side. The other side is that when they leave the group, they should no longer be able to track future membership changes in that group. So, I mean, that sounds pretty straightforward, of course. So there's nothing special in the goals we're trying to achieve. The only difficulty here was to make that efficient so that we don't have linear complexity everywhere. If linear complexity was okay, meaning you send out payloads, that scale linearly with a number of participants, then it would be a very easy problem to solve. So it was only about making that more efficient.
You were muted.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Raphael, for elaborating on FS and PCS. That wasn't quite clear there, I think. But yeah, maybe we can jump to the open problems, and there are still kind of a few that should be usable though. So how do we rotate keys? Connection key rotation, maybe also credential key rotation, although the tree rep stuff that we're looking at should make this a bit easier. And then there's the question of user level pseudonym rotation in groups. Can we, within a group, actually rotate the pseudonym? But then, of course, the pseudonym is used in the key packages of multiple clients, potentially. How do we rotate that, like en bloc? Or can we rotate one and then kind of in a delayed fashion rotate the others? How is that? If we only rotate one, what does a new joiner see? And those kind of things we have to worry about. All of this is, of course, solved if we use another kind of client management mechanism that we're working on in the MLS group called virtual clients, but that's still very experimental. But yeah, so there might be something interesting brewing there as well. Did I forget any open problems, Raphael? I think I added this slide relatively recently.
Not off the top of my head, no.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. There are probably, like, if we've already put a lot of this into a proof of concept and we tried this out, it generally works, but of course we might be missing stuff. So we'd be very thankful for feedback and people thinking through that with us. But otherwise, that's all I have. So if there are any questions or anything else we want to discuss on the metadata front. Brandon, yeah.
Hey, I just wanted to say that I think that the tree rep idea is really, really cool. I just would encourage you to apply it directly to the ratchet tree instead of applying it to the pseudonym.
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, if we want to apply it to the ratchet tree and encrypt the ratchet tree or parts of it, of course, we might lose the server's ability to do checks. I mean, we, of course, if we do pseudonyms, the server already loses track of who's really in the group. Yeah.
Right. The
Good
whole
question.
idea that the server can do policy enforcement is kind of fallacious.
Yeah. Okay, that's something we'll have to figure out. I hadn't really thought of that. So yeah, that'd be an interesting avenue to explore for sure.
So I don't see anybody else in the queue, and I just wanted to inquire with the group a little bit. First of all, like whether people feel like this approach has desirable privacy properties. Like, does this meet whatever you think the privacy requirements might be for metadata privacy in Mimi, and why or why not, and like what we're thinking as far as this being kind of mandatory part of the protocol, like mandatory to implement. Would love to hear people's thoughts on that.
So the fact that this is being applied to like a pseudonym layer instead of being applied directly to the ratchet tree, I think that that is creating a lot more sort of protocol junk that needs to be done. Like you need to think about connection key rotation, because then otherwise this messes with, or otherwise this degrades the level of anonymity or privacy that you get. But I think if the tree wrap idea were applied directly to the ratchet tree, then you would have the performance benefit of server assist, while also having the privacy benefit of an encrypted ratchet tree. But in the current way that it's done with the pseudonyms, it makes it sort of overly complicated, and it degrades the privacy that you get. So that's my thought.
So just to understand, if with your suggestion to apply to the whole ratcheting tree, that would prevent the server from tracking commits, right?
The server can still see when commits happen, but it can't necessarily see what is in the commit. And
yeah, sorry, I meant more like it cannot reconstruct the tree and then assist clients with the ratcheting tree as they want to run it.
Well, the thing is that I think that the way that in this model, the server would not need to reconstruct the ratchet tree to be able to provide it proactively to users, because the ratchet tree is already encrypted by the users in the group, and so you provide the encrypted blob, and so that's how you get the efficiency of server assist. The server doesn't need to see commits to be able to reconstruct the ratchet tree, because it has it in its encrypted form to provide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think the server would lose a bit of visibility, and it would, like, for example, in the pseudonymous mode, we could still have like roles where you have admins and regular users, and the admins can add users, and the server would be able to track that a user is adding another user or something. Whereas in the encrypted approach, I don't think that's possible. So that's something we would lose on the server side. So we really have to think through applying policy on the client side. And while I'd personally be happy to do that, I'm not sure, like, I'd be interested to hear from people who are more on the service provider side. Would that be an option? Or do you think that's a realistic option in terms of, would actual service providers be okay doing policy checking on the client side rather than on the server side already? I mean, with the limitation that even the pseudonym-based approach already hides information from the server. But yeah, maybe it's not the right collection of folks here in the meeting. Be interested to hear from folks from Google or something, if that be a realistic option in terms of their requirements. Oh yeah, Matthew.
I mean, I can't speak for any service providers on this, but I would be very surprised if folks were willing to entirely depend on client-side policy control, just from a pointy head boss perspective, rather than anything particularly rational. In terms of the earlier question of how the pseudo stuff feels in the context of Mimi, first of all, this looks really, really cool. Really impressed with the work going on here. And it's kind of exciting to see innovation in the privacy protecting characteristics that have come up. I'm not sure that it helps with DMA or interop at all. I fully support it as a really cool next generation encrypted group protocol. and think it's great. And frankly, if this was the direction that Mimi headed off in, that might end up being more valuable for the internet and the world than actually solving the problem of trying to glue things into WhatsApp, which seems to be what DMA has become. So I'm not sure whether it helps very much, particularly in the context of the charter, but I'm slightly conflicted on it and thinking, wow, this is cool. It'd be really nice to go off and implement this. But yeah, it just doesn't help with any interop with any of the existing silos where pseudo IDs aren't existing, if I understand the design correctly.
Yeah. I mean, we never really considered this an option for everyone. We like in our minds, lots of providers, like, sure, from the context of the DMA, like it might not be for everyone, but even in the context of Mimi potentially ending up like being a federation protocol on a more general level, I'm sure there are going to be like organizations who don't really care about metadata privacy and even want more control. Like they want to see which groups their employees, for example, are in. And so they want this visibility with the real world identities. And so in our minds, at least, I mean, Raphael, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's always going to be like this, these two use cases where one, you really want the metadata protection, and one you really don't want it because you rely on the functionality. And so maybe there's a world where we can have two Mimi modes. But yeah, I'm not sure how realistic that is in terms of still having a relatively nice protocol design. But yeah,
I mean, I think you could do it, but you're definitely literally wedging a round peg into a square hole, and vice versa. But it's cool. I mean, I encourage the work.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to do some working group archaeology, though I came from the fact that I initially asked if privacy was in scope or not in the charter, and the answer was yes, and that sort of led to us trying to come up with something, clearly, as Conrad said, as an alternative. But whether it's an alternative or the only mode, that's really not for us to say anyway. We're just working on the content here, because it's stuff we're doing anyway. So the working group can then decide what to do with it and what the scope should be.
Yeah, I think so. Really appreciate the work that you've put into this and presenting it on short notice. I think like people need to marinate on this more, and obviously you're going to continue to work on it anyway. So I don't know that we need like a working group disposition for it at the moment. I think people need more time to absorb it, and we're going to keep talking about it. It's good for now.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand your last sentence. Could you repeat that, please?
I'm just saying, like, I don't think like there's a working group decision to be made right now about this work. I think like you're going to keep working on it. People are going to, it's new, like people are going to keep evaluating it and sending you comments. And I think that's a good state to be in for now.
Okay, so we're going to keep trucking along. Is there anything that folks would want to see more details on? So tree wrap, people have said, is potentially interesting for multiple reasons. So that's certainly something we're still looking into and refining. Anything else that people find interesting that we should, like in a next version of the draft, that we should put down in a bit more detail? Okay. In which case, we just keep going and try to add details where we can. Tim?
Yes, no, I agree with that direction. Yeah, so it sounds like then that we're done with this topic for today. I guess that's like last call for the queue on this. Okay, in that case, we have 20 minutes left on the clock. So what's on the agenda is then to go back to Mimi Transport. I guess we were working through the PRs. Richard, do you want to resume doing that? You're muted in Meet Echo.
Yeah, we could do that. I thought Rowan had brought up the content draft. If we wanted to bop over to that for a second.
Rowan?
I think I need another 3 minutes before I can give a slide.
All right, I can pull up the protocol PRs real quick.
Judging by how much time we spent on the last couple of things, I suspect we'd have time to maybe do one more PR on Mimi protocol, and then I think we'll have to wrap for today.
I think that if we basically, I wanted to talk about the scope of the second PR from the top. I think that would be useful, especially since Ori is here.
Yeah, by all means.
And like had some discussion with Alyssa about this being in scope, and she said yes, but it's like I think that would be useful, but we don't need to discuss the actual mechanism per se.
Tim, I have requested screen share.
Yep, sorry.
That's all right. So this is the PR, and this is the API. Rowan, you want to take it away? Are you there, Rowan? It means I'm mute. I can.
Hello. Yeah. So the idea here is that this is the internal identifiers. If you want to be able to search on a single provider, if you have a handle, or you have a nickname, you have an email address, you have a phone number, you have whatever that you have that on a particular provider, that you have a way that you could go and find whatever the internal identifier is for that user that you would use to request their, and this would be the user identifier, the internal user identifier that you'd use for fetching a key package. So for example, somebody knows my rowan.itf@gmail.com email address, and they just want to check, is there a user here that claims to use this email address? We're not, this is on this particular provider, right? So this would be like, I told somebody, I'm the, I am on this particular provider, and this, you can find me in this particular way. This is the handle that I use, or this is one of these other identifiers that you can use to find me there. So it seems that people are a bit split between whether this is in scope or not. So I considered this to be in scope, and Alyssa also said that she thought this was in scope because this is something that is happening only in the context of a single provider. And it's something that, when I say in the scope of a specific provider, the searching only happens given that you already have a particular provider in which you are searching. So it's not solving the provider discovery problem, which we will be discussing, on the 23rd or whatever.
Yeah. So yeah, I was going to ask how do you think this relates to discovery overall?
So I think that the provider discovery problem is largely about taking either an email address or a phone number when you don't know what providers the target uses, and you haven't provided you with any hints. They haven't told you what provider they're on. Maybe they haven't talked to you at all. And so it incorporates both the users, the target users. The discovery problem would incorporate both the target users' requirements, a bunch of verification requirements, since we, there's a sort of this concept of proof that John Peterson discussed at the last meeting, that these things are entirely absent, right? So if I already told Richard out of band, like, I'm on WhatsApp and this is the phone number that I used on WhatsApp, and it happened to be, a disposable phone number that I used when I was in Australia, that's perfectly okay. It doesn't need to, I don't need to provide a proof that I still own that phone number, because, maybe I don't even still own it. But I signed up for service on a particular provider with that number, and that's associated with me there. So this is not solving the problem of what happens if you've got multiple providers that say, this is the, I have this same service independent identifier associated with different users, which may or may not be the same actual person. It doesn't, there are a whole bunch of problems which are just don't exist in this model, because you specifically know which provider you're trying to target.
So seems like you're presuming, in our taxonomy of service independent identifiers versus service specific identifiers, you're presuming that there's kind of multiple flavors of service specific identifiers. There's like the human meaningful or user visible service specific identifiers, and then the purely protocol internal service specific identifiers that you would that you would use for things like key package requests. And then the point of this API is to map from the human meaningful or user visible SSI to a purely protocol internal SSI.
Yeah, and in fact, many services do. Many of the services that we are interested in potentially adopting Mimi do exactly this, right? Many of the sort of internal user identifiers are the UIDs, when the handle is certainly not. My handle on WhatsApp is is a phone number. My handle on FaceTime is an email address at Gmail. And neither of those services use that as the actual identifier that I would use to touch key packages.
So the thing that I don't get, though, is why it's necessary to enumerate the different formats of the user identifier. So it sounds like if I understand right, this is a response request thing where I've obtained like an identifier, a service specific identifier for the user somehow, that's like not spelled out here. And then I want to send that to the provider and exchange it for the URI from which I can fetch key packages. Why do I, like at the Mimi layer, need to know that the identifier in question was, I'm looking at the enum here, like an OIDC claim versus an email or whatever. Like, why can't the identifier be sort of opaque to the Mimi client?
Well, I mean, the search is more useful if you give more information, right? I mean, if I just say ROHAN and send that and say search for this, right? This is different than if I could search for ROHAN and find, that there could be 17 partial matches for that. Some in some fields that are searched, or I could say this is specific to the handle and there's only one that is an exact match, and maybe 3 partial matches.
Okay, I see. I mean, I suppose I would need to better understand in this, I guess, to something we were talking about before, how this fits into the broader picture of discovery. Like, how did the client in this case get the object that they're using as the basis for the query? It sounds like you're envisioning that they could be starting with like a natural language search for like Rowan Mayhe, right?
Well, you just have to go look at what a bunch of different existing providers do. because some of them do allow you to search in particular fields. Some of them just say, you know, I'm going to search for anything in the profile, or I'm going to search, like, for example, like wire, if you put an @ sign before it, it searches only among the handles. If you put, you know, if you just put some free text and don't have an @ at the beginning, then it's going to search, you know, it's going to search for any name that matches. WhatsApp is going to match differently, right? There's, of course, WhatsApp is largely matching in your contact list. So there's.
I just wonder whether people are going to end up using, like, I don't know, one of the cases of this enum, like handle maybe the content is presumably like a free form string. And I wonder if people are just always going to end up using that because it's like the most general. But I do believe your claim that, you know, that this is informed by existing deployed systems, and that is generally persuasive to me in the context of Mimi. I guess I don't have anything to add past that.
I guess just to try and reiterate or clarify what the, I guess, like purpose of this would be, from like a client user experience perspective, I guess like there would be, say, a messaging provider that has a list of other providers they have agreements with, for instance. And it's just like, hey, I want to talk to somebody who I know is on WhatsApp. And so they can click the WhatsApp button, and then they have a search field. They type whatever in, and then they immediately go to, or they use this API in the backend to resolve that. Is that roughly correct?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. In that case, then yeah, I think it makes sense from a discovery point of view, and how it would be complementary to some of the other work, where you might not necessarily know which provider somebody wants to be contacted on. Whereas, yeah, here you already know, and so it's a little bit easier in that sort of sense.
Okay. Cool. All right. So I've introduced the concept. I think we're not going to make any decision here, and I wanted to still have an opportunity to discuss, you know, to sort of preview also this content format. So I'm about to send something to Tim.
Actually, having read it again, I have another gripe, which is that you have this spelled out as a GET request, but then there's a body. And I think we're going to get yelled at for that.
Yeah, good point.
So, like, I think query might be appropriate. I forget what the cool new method is.
Yeah, I'll create an issue for that. Thank you. That's an easy fix. Or I won't create an issue because it's already a PR, but I'll put it in the.
I'll just leave a comment.
Okay. I don't know if anybody can still hear me, but
yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I sent an email to Tim with 2 slides. If he's still around and wants to pop those up, I could.
Oh yeah, got it. Just give me a sec to get those.
So just to refresh people's memory, so we had a discussion in Brisbane about the Mimi content format needing to pick a concrete syntax. We did a straw poll between using the TLS presentation language and CBOR, and we came up roughly 50-50 for each one. TLS presentation language being already in use for MLS, and CBOR being, you know, a little bit more designed for this sort of general purpose content format as a general purpose binary format definitions. Let's see here.
It might be, if you're in a position to share your screen, that might be the quickest way to get to where
Sure, let's
we're
do
going.
it. Okay.
You should have share screen towards the bottom of your Meet Echo.
Do you see it?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Oh crap! This is I'm not sure it's going to allow me to do this without quitting. Well,
Okay, hang on a sec. Go ahead, give it a shot.
Okay, let's see if this works. Permission denied by system. Okay, sorry about that.
All right, I just received your slides, so I'll throw them up real quick. Keep talking.
Okay, so to be perfectly honest, there was not a huge difference in this in the size of the, you know, and both were like, it's a little bit we have sort of a schemaless and schema full representations of data formats, and in both of these cases we're using a you can kind of like zoom in a time.
Rowan, I think we lost you for a second.
Yeah, I reconnected, but my audio became muted after I came back. So okay, so in this is the first example from the content from the Mimi content document. So we've got one of the differences is that CBOR tries to represent things in a more generally in a more compact way. So and TLS presentation language just sort of lists items in a struct in the order in which they appear. And so here we've got, you know, one byte to say there's no replaces header because we're using the optional struct for the replaces information. We've got the length of a topic ID vector. We've got a 32-bit expires date. You know, all these things that turn out to be 0 in TLS presentation language. And then we start with our body. We're providing a body that's going to be rendered. And then we have the length of the content type and then the length of the binary content. And we send those items. In CBOR, we're doing much the same thing. Whenever there, in some cases, when there is you know, when something is not present, rather than using, we have the ability to represent something as null. And every field is identified with some kind of type. So we can represent, you know, that replaces as null rather than having a, you know, a 0 for a field that says is replaces present or not. So this is you know, quite comparable, right? These are two octets in difference, and you know, both require some kind of a decoder to be able to actually like read what the heck is going on. if you could go to the next example, the next page, there's a slightly lengthier example. And so in this case, the TLS presentation language is slightly smaller because there are individual elements inside of a vector don't need a type and a length. But this is, this is about as complicated as the preamble part of the, the sort of quote unquote header section of a Mimi content document, Mimi content message would be. And so in this case, we were editing a message, so we're replacing a previous reply. So it has the replaces, it has the in reply to related fields, and I also used a last seen, which contains multiple elements. So there are two messages which were the last seen, and then we have again a short markdown message and the content type at the bottom. Not a huge difference here. So I've already received some feedback about, hey, like try doing it this way in CBOR. I would encourage people to give comments about, am I holding it wrong for either TLS presentation language or CBOR? Those are going to be the most valuable things initially. And then if anybody wants to go and say, we want to do a like head-to-head in terms of performance, or somebody wants to like talk about library support or what have you, that's also useful information. But I think I want to make sure that we have a faithful representation of the structure that is the most idiomatic using those two formats as we can get. And so that's what I'm looking for from people as the sort of first order.
Okay. Well, we're past the scheduled time for today, so I think we'll have to pursue that discussion on the mailing list or at a subsequent interim. On which point, before we go, I should remind everyone that there's one more interim scheduled already on April 23rd. There, the focus will be on discovery requirements, and I think also we're going to hear about one proposal for discovery. Beyond that, of course, like the chairs are willing to schedule more interims, say to pursue the conversations we've been having today. So please reach out to us if you're interested in that. Otherwise, yeah, we'll see you all on April 23rd. Please check the data tracker and the mailing list for more details on the schedule, on exactly when that's happening, as well as Meet Echo links and the like. Okay, thanks everybody.